Thank you for joining this BERA virtual event. First, a quick few points for you to get the best experience from our event. You will have the opportunity to ask the speakers questions throughout the presentations by clicking to the right-hand side of the page. You can like other people's questions to make them more popular, for a better chance they will be answered by the speakers. There will be polls throughout the event. These will appear on the right-hand side automatically once open. Let's do a quick one now. Don't forget to tweet throughout the event using the hashtag shown on this slide. Now over to the chair.
Welcome members and friends of BERA and AARE to this special event hosted by the BERA Educational Research and Educational Policy Making SIG. My name's Nicole Mocker. I'm an education policy researcher and Associate Professor of Education in the Sydney School of Education and Social Work at the University of Sydney. And I'm very pleased to be chairing this morning or this evening's webinar, depending on where you're located, and hence whether you'll be logging on over perhaps a morning coffee or an evening GMT. As is customary in Australia, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I'm privileged to live and work, land which has been a centre of learning for millennia, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I'd like to pay my respect to their elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and indeed to all First Nations people here today. So we're here today to discuss great mistakes in education policy and how to avoid them. As an aside, there's been some discussion in my own university as to the words that might be underneath the correction tape on the front of the book, which I notice you can't see on the screen there, so I'm just going to hold it up for you. And we do have some suggestions as to what might be under there, most of which are a bit too rude for me to share on a transnational webinar, but I'd invite you to conduct your own forensic investigation when you have the opportunity to do so. I'd like to introduce our speakers and panellists today. First, the co-authors of the book, Ruth Lupton and Deborah Hayes. And I'm assuming that if you've logged on to this event, then these two are probably no strangers to you. Ruth is Honorary Professor of Education at the University of Manchester, and Deb is Professor of Education and Equity and the head of the school head of school at the University of Sydney. Both have very substantial histories of researching the role of policy and practice in both sustaining and dismantling educational inequities and inequalities. Our panellists today are Professor Barbara Comer of the University of South Australia, Dr. Sol Gamsu of Durham University, Professor Gemma Moss of UCL Institute of Education, and Dr. Sam Seller of Manchester Metropolitan University. The format of the webinar will be that shortly I'll invite Ruth and Deb to give us an overview of the book. We'll move to some reflections and discussion from the panellists in two lots with some questions from the floor in between. And so I'd encourage you to use Slido to submit your questions and to upvote those questions submitted by others throughout the presentations and discussions, and I'll direct those to our speakers on your behalf. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Ruth and Deb.
Thank you. Ruth, you're waiting for me. It must be my turn.
No.
So we just wanted to give this quick overview before we get started of how we're going to summarise the book. And hello to everyone. It's really lovely to have so many people logged in and have this opportunity to share our book with you. Ruth, I'm going to let you take the first slide.
Okay, thank you. And today we really want to focus on the how to avoid education policy mistakes in the future bit of our title. And we want to try and make that as interactive as is possible, given the fact we can't all be in the same room. But to kick that off, we just want to give you a brief overview of the book and its arguments so you can understand where we're coming from. Perhaps the first thing to say is that the book looks back over 30 or 40 years. So it's not an analysis of the effectiveness of the pupil premium in England or the funding system in Australia or other specific contemporary policy debates. We're trying to make some bigger points with the benefit of a longer term view. And the central argument, the starting point really, is that education policy in both England and Australia is persistently failing to respond adequately to entrenched problems of economic, social and spatial divisions that we see as the big issue of our time really. And that we need to face up to the fact that despite repeated claims that the objective of education policy is to reduce educational inequalities, that isn't happening. Or if it is happening, it's happening at an absolutely glacial rate. And in fact, the system works particularly badly for the most disadvantaged and marginalised young people, not just in terms of headline attainment gaps, but also in terms of their experiences at school. And we show in the book evidence of misrecognition, undervaluing of those young people, underinvestment, and sometimes exclusion from school altogether. And more generally, our education systems become dominated by tests, and we've eroded the professionalism of teachers in ways that make them less able to make a difference. So overall, we argue that our systems are neither better nor fairer, which is what we should expect and hope for. But even though those problems have been really well documented and analysed by researchers and recognised in official reports and inquiries, policies continue to go in the same direction. So the question is, what would make those things change for the better? And we argue that we need to lift our eyes from the short term and specific and gain a clear shared understanding of the big things that have gone wrong. And we suggest there are 5 of these, 5 fundamental mistakes or wrong turns in education policy that have become embedded in the way that we do things. And they're on the slide here. We describe them as turning to the market, letting test scores drive policy, over-prescribing teachers' work, misunderstanding the causes of educational inequalities, and leaving knowledge of educational research and practice out of education policy making to too great an extent. And these together have contributed to inequalities becoming baked into systems such that they can't be fixed by what we call policy tweaks, short-term policy improvements. I really want to stress that we are not pretending to have discovered these mistakes. They've all been extensively documented by others, including our panelists today and probably many of our participants. But in our analysis, we're trying to show how these mistakes compound each other and also how their effects are particularly acute and particularly damaging for young people from disadvantaged backgrounds. And we're arguing for a renewed focus on these 5 big key issues as the underpinnings of other problems in education policy. And what we're really saying is once you can get that focus and recognise and acknowledge these 5 big underpinning problems, it becomes more possible to assemble a clear agenda for policy change, which we then go on to set out at the end of the book.
Thanks, Ruth. And it's been a terrific experience working with Ruth on this book, particularly just getting her insight into policy in the English context in particular, but having the opportunity to talk about the comparisons between both our countries. And I think we didn't feel as though we could finish the book without saying something about how we felt things might change in the future. That would be a little bit of a cop-out if we didn't at least try and say something about what we felt might constitute a blueprint for change. I've just want to select some of those things to talk with you about here. And I'll go through them fairly quickly, but a wider vision of education, again, reinforcing that there are a broader purpose to schooling. It's more than about academic attainment and skill acquisition. You know, you would tend to think that it's really, education is just about testing achievement, but we really want to emphasize and restate that wider, broader vision. The blueprint for change should be a blueprint that includes education for all, and particularly inclusion and not exclusion. And we spend some time in the book providing some fairly alarming data about the extent of exclusion in both our countries. Continuing to reconceptualize inequality, and this has been a long-term project in both our countries over decades, but continuing to emphasize that we shouldn't be blaming families and kids for a system that doesn't serve them well. Understanding education policy more broadly, and there'll be a lot said about that tonight. Continuing to level the playing field, because the field keeps on tilting, and I think the pandemic illustrated that in yet another way, how circumstances and context change in ways that really shine a very strong light on the impact of inequality on schooling and on kids' ability to participate. Building systems for collaboration, and we don't think this means abandoning choice, but about supporting autonomy and assisting schools to develop distinctiveness and sort of local ecosystems of schooling, rather than schools defined by their fences, but those sort of the local ability of schools to cooperate. Reducing the volume of testing, and also increasing the range of testing and testing literacy, so that people understand that assessment is actually can be a very good thing, but we need to use it wisely. We need to target it so that it's the assessment matches well to the desired outcomes we're wanting to map and assess and compare. And accountability, not distortion. You know, it's fundamentally not good to distort the activities that things are intended to measure. So if we just move on to the next slide to just emphasize that, you know, really what we're wanting to do is to discuss in this webinar how all this can be changed. And we believe there's a strong basis for a broad consensus about what needs to change and what the problems are. And sometimes I think we need to remind ourselves of that, because the debate is often so divisive and so contentious that building that consensus and finding those points of agreement is a really important starting point. And now seems to be a moment when people are looking afresh at problems. And, you know, in some quarters anyway, that's what we think. There's a new urgency to find solutions. But the problems are big, and our policy-making processes and the way we produce evidence as well seem to be so intransigent to change. So there needs to be change if we're going to get out of this mess and avoid making these same mistakes in the future.
So I just want to speak a little bit about our analysis of the problem with policy making processes and suggest some ideas about better relationships between research and policy. So one issue, or we argue, is it's quite hard to see the problem clearly. Although we recognise that seeing the problem clearly, it's not, you know, it's not just an evidence problem that's a problem with policy, but this is one of the problems. And one thing is just about the volume of evidence and the contradictory claims that are made about them. It's really hard to keep up with the literature in any one of these areas which we write about, and much harder if you're trying to look across the piece. So it's difficult to, as we put it, to see the wood for the trees through all this evidence and contradictory claims. At the same time, academic research, of which there is so much on these themes, tends to speak to a relatively small audience, and critical education scholarship is vulnerable to claims of being politicized, which means that the evidence there isn't always heard. On the other hand, politicians and the policy community are very much focused on short-term agendas rather than more fundamental problems, and we wonder whether you know, our book with its 30-40-year view is actually appealing to politicians, or seems on to sort of large and long-term a scale. And where people who work in the system don't always have access to this broader or longer term view. So their hopes and possibilities for change can be very much constrained by current realities and dealing with current policy reforms. And we found ourselves stuck in a divided and polarized debate where it's hard to suggest change without being labeled as being against higher standards, for example, or stuck in the dark ages. So because of all of this, it's hard to see what the key issues really are, and crucially, it's hard to see what people across the system might agree on. We also argue that policymakers become too divorced from educational research and practice. I want to say we're not kind of harking back to a golden age when this was all perfect, but we do think that 4 relatively recent changes have made matters worse here. One is the uncritical acceptance of the global education reform paradigm, or GERM, market standards, testing, conformativity, and so on, so that they become normalized. Another is the upscaling and centralization of decision making, moving it further from the chalk face. Another is that policy space has become both more dispersed and more crowded with many more actors in it. And it's become more attentive to, with technological change, to bite-sized chunks of knowledge with less policy memory and less depth of understanding. And there's also become greater reliance in the last 10 to 20 years on quantitative research, both the growth of education economics and of the what works tradition. And the consequences of these changes, we argue, is that evidence is often misunderstood in ways that we try to demonstrate through the book, and also that valuable knowledge is often disregarded. And in particular, we say we're not looking enough at what's happening in the most disadvantaged places and to the children and young people for whom policy matters most. And one of the features of the book is that we draw on a set of case studies by other authors of schools in some of these most disadvantaged places to make those issues more visible. And overall, we argue that if policymakers listen more to people who understand how schools and classrooms actually work, they'd understand their evidence base better, and they'd be wiser in drawing from the experience of other countries, more likely to anticipate the effects of policies on teachers and learners, and better equipped to avoid unintended policy consequences. So we set out a range of suggestions about how policy could be better connected to education, research and practice, and some of those are set out on this slide. I won't go through them all. One of our suggestions is that education research funding should be spent more broadly, not just with its current emphasis on what works studies, but with independent, broad-based research institutes with a mandate and resources to conduct, synthesize, and disseminate multidisciplinary research. We also argue that we need to see teachers as producers of knowledge, not just consumers of research. And we wonder whether we're at a point where we, in both countries, where we need a once in a generation commission or other similar exercise, which helps us to rethink the purpose and design of our education systems. And we'd love to hear your thoughts on these suggestions, but also your own ideas on this theme during the discussion. And then finally, when we've been writing this book, we've deliberately taken a rather different approach to the normal critical education policy work, and Deb's just going to tell you a little bit about that.
Thanks, Ruth. Yeah, we just felt it was important to try and lay bare, in a sense, where we were coming from, and to try and put that into the mix of this discussion tonight. So, one of the things that we believe is that better evidence won't necessarily change the behaviour of policymakers, but if more people understand and appreciate the evidence, then it's more difficult for them to keep making the same mistakes. Be really interested in your comments and whether you believe these things along with us. Also, that there's actually no lack of evidence, that the problems are clear and big, And one of the things we've attempted to do in the book is to cut through the huge volume of research claims and counterclaims to make the problems even clearer. And I think we're both quite proud of the length of the reference list. There's, you know, we've really tried to draw upon a very wide range of research and to include it sort of fairly in a sense in the book. So we've also written a short book, which was incredibly challenging. And we hope it's written in plain English for a general audience. Some of the other parts of the approach that we've taken we've deliberately chosen to believe that, you know, the goals of education policy are generally well intended. And I think what that means is as well that policy makers are generally well intended, but that the plans have failed. And we've tried to talk about these failures without finger pointing and blaming. And sometimes that was very difficult, but that's what we have attempted to do. I know there's no such thing as a neutral position, but we've attempted to adopt one. In fact, deliberately trying to detach policies from their ideological origin on the basis that it's more likely to build a shared understanding of the problem. At the same time, you know, again, that's something I'll be very interested to hear your comments on and how much you believe that is sustainable. But we've also asked some simple questions in an open-minded way. And so the chapters are framed, some of the chapters, a set of chapters are framed by why were these policies adopted? What's the evidence that they made education better and fairer? And we've tried to run these questions through our analysis of the policy mistakes that we've identified. And just finally, the last bit of our approach is that we've attempted to take a long view. Some parts of the book span up to 30 years or even more. It's not historical in the sense, but there is some tracing of policy. That's been one of our deliberate approaches to try and trace policy in both countries and to mark its significant sort of turning points. And we've attempted a synthesis of evidence, drawing on different kinds of research, and in particular, drawn on case studies of schools in the most disadvantaged areas to try and examine the impact of policy in those areas. Over to you, Nick.
Thanks very much for that overview, Ruth and Deb. We're going to move straight into some responses from our panelists now. I can see that some brave souls have started us off with the questions. Please keep those coming while we move into some reflections from our panelists. And they're going to offer some reflections on this analysis and how far we have a broadly shared consensus on what needs to change to make education better and fairer. So I'm going to hand over first of all to Gemma. We're going to have 3-minute reflections from each of the 4 panelists, and then we'll come back for some Q&A. Over to you, Gemma.
Thank you very much. And thank you to both Deb and Ruth for getting this book out at such a timely moment. Look, I think optimism is in short supply, and in a way the poll at the start of this event suggested that that's the case. What I really like about the book, though, is it's able to state that this is a failure of policy. You are presenting evidence of policy failure rather than blaming teachers, blaming communities for what they themselves are failing to do. And in a way, that for me is the start of being able to do what you're calling for, have a once in a generation exercise in rethinking the purposes and design of our education systems. We badly need to. Over here in the UK, COVID has been harsh. It's also impacted most on our most fragile and vulnerable communities. I am now on to my 4th project looking at the impact of COVID on education. And I want to take you back immediately to some of the evidence we collected in May during the first lockdown using a 3rd sector organisation. which surveys teachers regularly and collect from teachers information on their schools, quite precise about the nature of the school community that they're serving. So it uses a unique school identifier. Right back in June, we asked those, in May, we asked the teachers who replied to our survey representative sample what they thought the opportunities and challenges were facing education post-crisis. 77%, right the way across the board, said if testing and inspection go ahead next year, schools serving our most disadvantaged communities will be unfairly penalised. 72% said schools have an important role in building community resilience. 73% said primary education needs to begin again with a broader definition of curriculum values and purposes. 4%, just 4% said the best approach to supporting kids through the crisis is to ensure they reach the expected standards in Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2. This is a big moment in which to start a conversation about what is wrong in education at the moment and redefine the terms upon which that conversation happens. I think this book is a great way to start that. And in a way, well, I could probably and should just stop there, but I'm going to put into the conversation, what is the role of research at this moment? I think it's to help re-engineer the world. It is not to stand back and comment on it. It's actually to try and make something different happen.
Thanks very much, Gemma. Barbara Comer, over to you. You're on mute, Barbara.
Sorry, everyone. Just trying to unmute here. Look, it's very wonderful to be invited tonight, and I just want to let you know that I'm coming to you from the lands of the Kaurna people in South Australia. And thank you again so much to Deb and Ruth for this wonderful book. We were asked to think about the extent to which the book reiterates and illustrates the kind of three main areas, I guess, that they summarise, and whether that was similar and whether there were other things we want to add. So at the beginning of one of their chapters, Deb and Ruth point out the similarities in our education system is in terms of what's wrong, or the dominance of tests. And for me, the next point, the ways in which the least advantaged children and young people are often least well served by education, which is, I think, the major challenge, ongoing challenge of our generation. And also for me, the key point about how the work of teachers and school leaders is changing so that we're making less good of what they describe of this valuable resource. So those three key points I think are absolutely phenomenal. Is there anything missing in this analysis? I guess for me in Australia, what also has contributed to our great mistakes in educational policy is the influence of the media, and I would name particularly the Murdoch press. I think, though, that we are at an important moment, and I think if COVID did one thing in Australia, it was to make parents more sympathetic and media more sympathetic to teachers and schools. As people started to experience the effects of children being at home day after day or learning online, a new respect, I think, was forged for teachers and school leaders. In terms of the impact that we're already aware of, as has happened elsewhere in times of disasters, and I think Cindy Katz puts it really well, feminist geographer, writing after Katrina, Cyclone Katrina, writes that geography is always socially produced. And so every landscape can reveal sedimented and contentious histories of occupation, struggles over land use, and clashes over meaning, rights of occupancy, and rights to resources. From my perspective, what COVID's done is to show once again how disasters compound the effects of inequality and disadvantage. In terms of the kinds of schools in which I and Deb and Ruth and others work in, we can see that the complexities associated with poverty for families, children, teachers and school leaders is compounded by COVID. So rather than things just simply changing, we have the compounding of already existing disadvantage. And what that means from my perspective is that that increases hugely the work of teachers and families in the most disadvantaged areas. Thanks very much.
Great, thanks a lot, Barbara. Sam Seller, over to you.
Thanks, Nicole, and thanks, Ruth and Deb, for the opportunity to engage with your wonderful book. I found the analysis of problems with policymaking in the book comprehensive and convincing. I think it provides an ideal introduction to students of education policy, whether they be teachers undertaking their initial education or ministers in need of a crash course in education policy. And I also think it's a very timely invitation to work collectively to realise the blueprint for change that you've set out. To my mind, the fifth mistake, the divorce between policymaking and education research and practice, is central. Ruth and Deb clearly show how globalisation and policy convergence, centralisation and ministerialisation, along with the fragmentation of policymaking within network governance, create a perfect storm that underpins this divorce and compounds the other four mistakes. So I want to focus on this aspect of the analysis and respond to two of the questions in particular. Has COVID made a difference, and are other things important? So first, I agree that the pandemic has, in a number of ways, created fertile conditions for consensus about what needs to change. However, at the same time, it has also contributed to the dispersal and crowding of policy spaces, due in part to significant growth in education markets over this period. In particular, we've seen significant investment in the education technology sector, encouraged by influential non-government and international organisations who do have the ears of ministers. Global investment in EdTech more than doubled in 2020, up to 16 billion, and it grew by 76% in the UK. And schooling is by far the largest sector of this market. So I think we may be seeing a step change that will have an impact on the futures of schooling. Now, the products and services provided by the tech industry play an influential role in shaping how information is collected, analysed, and valued as evidence within schools and education systems. And we've certainly seen this occurring for some time in Australian education departments and schools. So recognising the growth and influence of these new corporate actors, as well as new experts inside governments and schools like data scientists, is an important piece of the puzzle. While these actors may share the analysis with regard to the need for better and fairer education, they are by nature likely to favour market solutions and are less likely to see testing as a mistake or to engage substantially with teacher and expert research. And their voices and agendas do play a role in shaping policy. The impact of this development is implicit in Ruth and Deb's discussion of how education has been left out of education policy making. And I think it warrants further attention as part of efforts to build consensus. Despite the recent growth, this is still an emergent industry, and I think critical education researchers have an opportunity right now to get in on the ground floor, so to speak, and to prevent teacher and expert research being disregarded by this growing group of policy actors. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Sam. And last but certainly not least, Sol Gamsu, over to you.
Hi, thank you. And I'd just like to echo my colleagues in really praising the book and the work that it does. And particularly, I'd just like to focus in on the translational approach of this book in allowing a lot of the research that comes, I think, from the critical sociology of education to be communicated easily. And I also think, I think my personal take towards research is that issue of it being vulnerable to being politicized is something that I personally tend to embrace because I think positioning myself as working within and with different educational and social movements is important to my research. And I'll say a bit more about that in responding to the book. But I think that a plurality of approaches is both important and critical to sociological research and education, and politically useful. And it's important to speak beyond and without ideological framing at some times, and the book does this exceptionally well. So to respond to the questions quickly, how far are we around attaining that broadly shared consensus? I'm going to throw it out there that I think, for me personally, the greatest opportunity that we had for a structural shift within educational policy making and politics was the Corbyn moment, the period when Jeremy Corbyn was the leader of the Labour Party. And I was personally involved in trying to push and develop some ideas around the National Education Service that were sometimes blocked or slowed by people within the party. I've little hope that the current shadow education team are really up to the scale of the problems faced in education, though they're clearly much more competent than the people who are in power in the state. But beyond party politics, there's a much more interesting state of affairs. And this is where COVID has really had a huge impact. And I'm going to run through a set of examples where I think there is real potential for progressive politics of education and movements and new forms of political consensus to be built around this. So these are things like the A-level and GCSE protests around examinations that happened last year, where we saw students really actively providing a language of class around exams on a scale and in a way that maybe hasn't happened since the 2010 tuition fee protests. We saw the National Education Union, the biggest union here in the UK, education union in the UK, take Section 44 action in January 2021 over health and safety concerns. And there's a creation of real grassroots power there. There's a potential to empower teachers, perhaps erode the power of high stakes testing because of the way moderation is now being done. There's also, and this is really important, the movements against racism, Black Lives Matter protest, but the toppling of Edward Colston, protests at Pimlico Academy, and the government rhetoric around decolonisation and race is actually inadequate. And they have, I think, lost the argument both amongst students and amongst teachers. I think there are possibilities for the left, and there are also possibilities for a broader consensus building, which I think is what this book speaks to. And those two sets of consensus can overlap.
Great, thanks very much, Sol. We're going to take some questions from the Slido now. So we're going to start off with one from Sonia Lopez. How do you think we can reach out to teachers across the system to encourage contribution to and ownership of this wider vision of education policy and, I guess, consequently of education? We might throw to Deb and Ruth, but if panelists would like to jump in, I think let's just see if we can get some discussion going.
Thanks, Nick. I saw that question and it's come right to the top of the Slido list. And I think I'd probably just change what needs to happen in terms of teachers. I mean, I think teachers probably don't need much encouragement to contribute and to take ownership of the wider vision of educational policy. I mean, I think they're pretty good at that already. I think what we need to do is respect, engage, and make space for them. You know, turn down the volume of policymakers and turn up the volume of teachers. I'm hopeful, you know, I keep hoping that politicians will begin to respect educational researchers and teachers in the same way that they are showing more respect for health professionals and, you know, the role of doctors and nurses in the community. So that's my hope anyhow.
Gemma, I could see you in furious agreement there. Did you want to jump in?
I'll jump in. Look, the most enlightened Tory that is conservative in this country at the moment on matters of education is Robert Halfon, who's the chair of the Education Select Committee, who ran an inquiry on COVID, and he actually sat and listened to all the evidence presented. He knows far more about what is going on because he listened to the evidence. The evidence is there on the ground. I'm sorry, I really do disagree with what Sam was saying about this is a moment for privatized companies to do X, Y, Z. That is not where the action is. The more we look at what those kinds of organizations are doing, the less we are paying attention to what is actually happening on the ground. What is actually happening on the ground through COVID in England is that teachers have fundamentally understood that the DfE has nothing to say to them about the problems that they face. That its absolute obsession with test and test outcomes makes no difference to the difficulties they were facing in trying to help kids stay safe during a crisis. There has been universal derision for what the DfE has been doing throughout. Same for Ofsted, our inspection agency. Yes, they will try and regroup. Yes, they will try and come back. We need to be saying as much as we can to teachers that's encouraging them to be agentic and say no. All right, that's the simple politics of the situation at the moment. We need to turn our telescope away from the people who, in Charles Taylor's terms, their social imaginary about the world they're trying to build is just running out. It no longer operates. Okay, let's look the other way. What's going on down on the ground?
Could I come in?
Yeah, come on in, Sol.
I think I'd like to sort of partly echo Gemma's points and partly also say, and this again, I think links to that point that I was trying to bring in about pluralism within educational research and the positions we take, but that what is needed to unpick the 40 years of neoliberal education policy, and I do think there's a use in saying that term, even if we don't use it all the time, is the construction of movements and the long-term construction of movements that are capable of undoing what has been done. And there's an urgency to where we are now, but I think what has to happen needs to be long-term in its vision and in its lens, and that means really thinking about what our intellectual work does and how it relates to the building capacity, both with teachers, but also students, also parents, and how we politicize debates and make them communicable for those audiences.
Yeah, I'd just like to build on what Sol was saying there, and also Gemma. I think that one of the things that excites me most about the book, apart from its very persuasive arguments, is the way in which it has been written for a general audience. And look, to be honest, I can't wait to start buying multiple copies and giving it to as many people in the political system as I can. And the other place I'd want to send it, or the other places I'd want to take it and give it to, are all the professional associations. Because I think, you know, I am hearing these arguments from teachers, from parents. You know, as a grandparent, I struggle with the effects of synthetic phonics. I can't even say it, as you can tell, on a weekly basis. You know, if I have to pronounce one more absurd non-word in an attempt to prove to my 6-year-old grandson that reading's worthwhile, I think I might scream. So I think, you know, the extent to which COVID has made visible the complexity of the work that families do and that teachers and school leaders do in disadvantaged communities has created a particular kind of moment. But I also want to take on board, I think, the very important point that Sam is making about the moves of other players to try and force their way into this space in terms of saying, well, education is just a technological problem. So I think, you know, we are in a moment where those of us who've still got connections in the political, big P political need to do, everything we possibly can, whilst at the same time working with teachers and school leaders.
Can I come in there, Nicole?
Yeah, sure, Sam.
Yeah. So, I mean, I would just want to second Deb's point about, in response to the original question, the importance of amplifying the views of teachers rather than spreading the word. And I think there's important work that can be done in collaboration with teacher unions in that regard. And I mean, I accept your point, Gemma, about the importance of focusing on what's happening in schools and the disconnect that has emerged over the past year between the realities of schools and the imaginaries of policymakers. And I think that disconnect politically is an important space to work in order to make advances towards the kind of consensus that this book promotes. But I would say that I don't share your confidence that imaginary is running out of steam just yet. So I think we need to politically work with teachers and amplify the aspects of the pandemic that have drawn new attention to the value and worth of schools in communities and societies, while analytically keeping our eye on what's happening elsewhere.
Thanks, thanks, Sam. Look, I'd like to go. We've got a few minutes before we move into our next bit of our program. So I'd like to go to the second question that we've got on our list there from Alice Bradbury. Some insights into how accountability might work without the distortion that you were talking about earlier, Ruth and Deb, happening. So what kinds of insights have we got into that?
I know that Gemma has been thinking particularly about this, so if she doesn't mind, I'd like to give her the opportunity to come in here.
Well, a group of us from BERA convened an expert panel on assessment led by Harvey Goldstein, who sadly died at the start of COVID. And we have a proposal which is due for publication. I need to do a last bit on the publication to get it out, to replace the whole population testing system that we have in this country with a national sample, use a national sample to build stronger connections between research and those problems that self-evidently exist in the education system. We've used partly as our model a national sample that's used in Germany to fuel research. It leaves communities, practitioners out of the loop. It's just the national sample data talking to researchers who then go away and do X, Y, and Z. In our wildest imaginations, we think we could create a kind of space for talking about the data. And it's why, for me, one of the really important things about Ruth and Deb's book is that it refuses the notion that education failure is to do with the system, and it puts it squarely on policy, because that's the space we need to be in. We need to accept that, yes, disadvantaged communities do not do well through education. The right has got us on that one on the left, because it appears to be a failure of the left's own imagination and not theirs. Actually, we need to be able to reclaim where failure lies. It's partly in the economy, it's partly in how communities live, it's partly in what communities see as their own horizons of possibility. We need to be able to get into those spaces and rebuild what those horizons of possibility are on very different terms from the narrow framing that comes with testing.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Gemma. Ruth, did you want to just follow up there?
Yeah, and in addition to that, I think, and building on what Gemma just said, then I think we also need to look in England at our inspection system and think about more localized and supportive systems of inspection. And also with it, even leaving our accountability systems as we were, if we could move to shared accountability in local areas for the outcomes of all children, that would be less distortive of practice, because schools would need to be concentrating on what's happening to children in other schools in their local area as well as their own. So I think even within the frameworks we've got, I think we can move to less damaging, just as effective systems.
Great, thanks very much. Look, we're going to move to a quick poll before we head back to hear a little bit more from our panelists. And I think you should see on your screen now, if you go to polls, no. Oh, here we go. All right, so the question here is, does the post-COVID moment offer an opportunity for a new consensus on the big directions in education policy? I think we can probably say that there's no surprises there. So I think what we might do is move on to hear a little bit more from our panelists. They're going to give us some reflections here on how far the unusual approach taken in the book might be a way forward in building an evidence-based, and by this I mean actual evidence-based, as opposed to the selective use of evidence that we often hear of in relation to evidence-based practice or evidence-based policy. So, you know, how might that work? I will hand over to them, and I think we're going in the reverse order this time. So Sol, I'm going to hand over to you first.
Thanks. And in terms of the evidence-based consensus, I think my question would be, is this the only consensus we need? And has an evidence-based approach worked? And the distinction between what works and evidence-based is important, but I don't have time to go into that here. It's not that evidence doesn't matter, but for my sort of 15 years of education policy watching, and others have much longer, ideology tends to trump evidence. And I think what for me is key, and what the book I think contributes towards, is the possibility of building a broader movement than the left has generally been able to construct around some of these ideas for educational change, and perhaps picking up those who've fallen out with current government agendas and politicians, although I'm a bit less skeptical of Rob Halfon that Gemma mentioned before. We do need that consensus, and but I'm also in favour of building the basis for a much more radical educational settlement. And it's clear, I think, to many of my generation and those younger and others, that we need a structural change. And I do tend to support forms of abolitionist politics which align with decolonial politics. But I'm not one to throw out the baby with the bathwater in this, and I suspect we need multiple forms of political consensus that could, as I say, overlap. But really, if we're interested in unpicking marketization and structural inequality, we do need some of that language that might scare off or alienate people if not explained properly. And as educators, I think we can do that. What can the research community do? I think for me, it's about creating the basis for radical and progressive local education politics. I'm doing some work on the private school, state school funding gap, which is coming out today, and being able to help start conversations, hopefully local campaigns around these issues. And the question is, are we engaged in intellectual work that strengthens and creates long-term social and educational movements for equality against climate catastrophe and capitalism? And we've had really 40 years of disastrous ideological management of education in this country and Australia and abroad. And what predated neoliberal education policy wasn't exactly great either. And for me, I think I see the rest of my career as dedicated to thinking about how we engage intellectually and also practically in the work of constructing social and educational movements that are capable of sustaining and supporting educational change and broader societal change. Academia doesn't always foster this, and I think it's great that people like Ruth and Deb have written this book in ways which isn't necessarily about, the glory of big grants, your 25-star ref publications and prestigious American journals and all the rest of it. And in the end, you just got to ask yourself, what's all that for? And when you look back, what do you really want to say you've achieved? And I'll stop there.
Great, thanks, Sol. Over to you, Sam.
Thanks, Nicole. I also really appreciated the disposition that informs Ruth and Deb's approach in this book. I think it provides an instructive example for critical education scholarship, and I welcome the generosity that they extend policymakers by assuming their good intentions and seeking to build shared understanding. I think this approach does offer us a way forward, but I also agree with Sol's point regarding the difficult balancing act between evidence and ideology. To answer the question of what needs to happen next, I would emphasise the importance of addressing their second precondition for change, that is, developing greater learning capacity and depth of knowledge in policymaking by building links between different groups, governments, schools, universities and unions, and developing the capacity for local co-production of knowledge and practice. And I want to highlight two aspects of this work where I can see real opportunities at the moment. First, I think more can be done by critical academic researchers in partnership with teacher unions. Unions are always confronted with the impossible task of balancing short-term tactics to address industrial relations matters with long-term strategy to realise grand visions for fairer and better education. I think we can do more to support unions with the latter through long-term partnerships and co-producing research agendas that extend beyond discrete pieces of commissioned research, for example. I think we need to combine the clear-eyed synthesis of research evidence, as Ruth and Deb have done here, with research partnerships that support unions to develop evidence that can lead conversations about the futures of education. And then secondly, I think we can construct projects that help to bridge the distance between policymaking and what's going on in schools. And I often think back to a project that I worked on with colleagues in Queensland a few years ago, in which we tried to do just that. And I recall having a conversation with the director of the education system early on, where he expressed his appreciation for the kinds of school-based research that Deb and Ruth draw on significantly in this book, but told us that it just didn't help him to steer the system, and they really needed the numbers generated from NAPLAN and other sources in order to do that. And then later in the project, we brought another senior leader from the system into schools to actually talk with principals. And it was a really transformative moment for this senior policymaker. And I think that contact with schools and with principals made a real difference. So in terms of next steps, I would want to emphasize capacity building through developing networks that can help to produce and promote a more diverse range of evidence within dispersed and changing policy spaces. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Sam. Barbara, we're going to throw to you now.
Thanks so much. I really want to reiterate that how much I agree with the points that have already been made, particularly the idea of fostering conversations between different educational actors. And I think it's interesting to reflect on the young people who have had an impact in the media, particularly around climate change and the way in which they've operated and how they have in fact captured people's imaginations. And I'm thinking one of the things certainly that I'm still interested in doing is thinking about how we can, in our research with educators in schools, do more to foreground what young people have to contribute. It seems to me that there is I'm interested to hear Sol talk earlier too about his generation. And I'm thinking that there's still a lot of silence out there from a lot of young people. And the ways in which research might help broker what it is that young people have to say to speak back to education systems and policies, and the ways in which research might help foster conversations. And just to conclude, I think that there's something really quite unique about the genre here that, that Deb and Ruth have invented. It's cumulative, respectful synthesizing. It's careful and nuanced, but it still involves scrupulous interrogation of research and policy. And I love the way they concluded with the New Zealand PM, Jacinda Ardern. There is no you and us, there is only us. And I think, you know, that goes to the heart of it. You know, whose interests are served by breaking down those divisions that would say there's only us? So in what ways might we work with people to persuade them that at the moment the lack of coming to a consensus puts all of us at enormous risk?
Great, thanks very much, Barbara. And Gemma, over to you.
Well, I think if there is a consensus on this panel, it is that there is a need for change. I think where we probably differ is in what some people call theories of change. Now, that's an expression that emerged from NGOs trying to work in often dangerous and difficult circumstances abroad to address deep-seated social issues, poverty, gender violence, those kinds of issues. Theories of change take different kind of dimensions and different turns, and I'm listening to speakers offer different kinds of theories of change. What could we change, where and how? I do think there are very few points in trying to directly engage with policymakers who are using their position to make ideological picks. That one is not going to change. On the other hand, I was personally involved in getting a successful contract with funding from the DFE to design a phonics toolkit for the Adult Literacy Centre, which prevented and inhibited wholesale transfer of a phonics pedagogy from the primary school into the adult literacy sector, and instead developed a pedagogy that was respectful of what adults knew and involved them in using phonics knowledge as an investigatory tool for understanding how written language works. So for me, if I have a theory of change, it's that working with other people really matters. I absolutely pick up on that from what Barbara said, and also that it's important to look for the cracks. Where is the current discourse not sufficiently covering things over? That's where we need to be, and working with others. I don't think it's a question of us finding some evidence we can go deliver to somewhere else. There's too much deliverology going on in the world at the moment around knowledge flows, around influence and whatever. Deliverology is very different from actually co-partnering. And I am going to say co-partner, not co-create, because we stand as researchers, we do stand in a different relationship to knowledge making than maybe people on the ground, but we should be able to find a partnership and bring something to that table so that the community is richer from us having got involved.
Fantastic, thanks, Gemma. We're going to return to some of our questions on the Slido, and I'd encourage you, audience members, please keep going with the questions. We'll start working our way from the top, but if you've got questions that have come to mind while our panelists have just been speaking, then please add them to the list. So the next question, I'm very interested to hear what particularly the speakers based in England have to say about this one, that the government in England appears to be positioning itself to control what is valued as education research through the new Institute of Teaching. What can we do?
Yeah, well, I'll have a little go. It's really, really difficult because it's so difficult to influence the curriculum of initial teacher education so that beginning teachers start with a broader basis of educational research. But I think there is work, and it really speaks to what all the speakers have been saying about university and school partnerships, and we've got some good examples going in Manchester where academics are working with teachers and school leaders on their current contextual problems through critical analysis of research findings and bringing research and academic research and practical knowledge together. And so as part, I think there are things we can do as part of teachers' professional development outside the mainstream, and also thinking about how those that work can be accredited towards master's degrees, so that there are alternatives to the model of the professional development of teachers that are being offered by the Institute of Teaching. Gemma.
Thanks, Ruth. Gemma, did you want to add something there?
Just that I'm not wanting to minimise the effort that is going on in England at the moment to increasingly limit what people in education can do. I don't know if other people have noticed, but there's been a document recently come out claiming that the job of teachers is to, with fidelity, implement the curriculum that the government itself has nominated. This is a huge politicisation of the curriculum and the interference of politicians in what goes on. I return though to Charles Taylor's notion of a social imaginary. You can do that if you have the power to do it. Will it lead to better teacher retention in schools living in high poverty circumstances? No, it won't, because actually all you will do is under-equip teachers going into difficult contexts where they can't stay. That's been the entire experience around Teach First. So we have to remember these are mistakes. These people are dreaming up solutions that won't work. Our job is to come up with and try and retain and rebuild an appropriate knowledge base. And I know Ruth is familiar with examples in Manchester that are doing exactly this. What is the appropriate knowledge base to exist in a high poverty community and deliver good education that makes sense to that community, which may operate on very different bases from what the policymakers say you should do.
Thanks, Gemma. Sol.
Yeah, I just wanted to come in on that point because I think this is one place where we have to be a bit careful with the framing, because I don't think that the government's interventions to control what teachers are teaching and in a linked way in higher education to attack critical race theory, to belittle and undermine decolonial movements, those things are not mistakes. They're deliberate ideological attacks which aim to create a much more authoritarian, nationalist, and restrict any possible, as many possibilities as possible for critical intellectual activity within education. Now, there's a separate question over how successful they will be, and I think I think they won't manage as much as they want to, but if they scare enough people, and you've already seen things like, someone holding a Palestine flag being punished in school, a kid doing that. If they get enough people, it will still have a very substantial effect, and I don't think we can belittle that point. And this is where actually I think our role as researchers is to embed ourselves within movements that are capable of resisting some of these things. And I don't think we can shy away from actively politicizing what is going in our analysis and also our practical response to that.
Great, thanks, Sol. Were there any other panelists that wanted to jump in there before we move on to the next question? Barbara.
Yeah, just to say that I think that, I want to agree with that point that Sol is raising there. These are not just mistakes, these are intentional interventions in people's lives. And I guess, one of the worst examples that I can think of in my life is the way in which the Murdoch press has contributed to similar kinds of ideological manoeuvres that have made an enormous difference and continue to make an enormous difference to educational policy and practice in Australia, and got away with it. So, from my perspective, one of the things that is missing from our discussion is the ways in which we can not only work with fellow-minded colleagues and activists and educators, but the way in which we can either build media ourselves, which is, an instance of that tonight. But what if, for example, we invited and had another seminar like this where we did invite Tanya Plibersek, who, for those of you in the UK won't know, that she's the shadow person in education in Labor, and other other politicians as well as policy makers to a replication of this. So webinars for like-minded academics and educators are absolutely fantastic because it allows us to do some rehearsal of what we might need to do and what we, you know. But I think, you know, one of the areas where I've tried, and I should say failed, is to use the public media better to get our messages out about what is actually going on and what people's experiences are in schools, particularly in schools in areas of disadvantage.
One of the eye-openers on what is going on in schools has been the COVID experience of parents trying to teach their kids at home at a time when Ofsted, using what I can only describe as a cod version of cognitive science, was trying to suggest the key thing to do was to keep to the routine, to repeat as often as necessary so that the child would learn from deliverology, delivering of a content that the parent and the children couldn't understand. That changes the terms of the conversation. I do think what is at issue here is to do with theories of change, and it is to do with how we conceptualize how change can actually happen and what responsibility we then take and where we put our effort in trying to make things happen. Our COVID projects have quite deliberately not bothered trying to contact politicians and make them make the change. What we have done from our COVID project is put out briefing notes that can speak directly to teachers, that can reinforce the notion that their common sense around all of this, that they are working in a balmy system that does not work in the best interests of children, is correct, because they need to know that. That's the answer to a media that will beat up on teachers and try and blame them for everything that's going on in COVID and has no conception of what teachers have actually been doing. So again, it really does come back down to theories of change. And I think for me, that's a conversation that the research community still hasn't really grappled with. I think we have a very unclear idea of what change research can really bring about. We have immature understanding of how that can develop. And for me, we can only learn if we try and get engaged. So if I think of your work, Barbara, you have a very long history of precisely getting engaged with the communities you want to work with. And the lessons that come out from that can then contribute to a broader conversation within the academic community and perhaps change what and how we act.
Great, thanks, Gemma. Look, our next question is, you know, I think it's quite a delightful little thought experiment, this one. So I want to ask the panel, what advice would you give to a new senior bureaucrat or minister who's not had school experience other than as a parent or a student? And we can probably all think of some of those, both in Australia and in England. So what kind of advice do you think as a community we should be trying to, you know, help provide to people in those kinds of situations?
Just really quickly.
Well, I give them the book.
And then they all speak at once. Jeb, why don't we go to you and then Barbara and then Sam, and then we'll just kind of go from there.
I'd give them the book, but if I had the chance to actually sit down and talk with a minister, I'd listen. You know, I'd really try and figure out what their experiences of schooling and parenting were. You know, it's coming to that point Barbara was saying, these forums are great because we get to rehearse, you know, the logic of our arguments and how we develop them. And I would actually love that opportunity to sit down with a minister and hear their experiences and try and figure out, you know, what makes them tick and what sort of motivates them. Because I know that the speeches we hear and all of that really isn't sort of what's within their own experiences. So that would be mine. I guess the ethnographer would come out in me and I just want to sit and listen.
Thanks, Deb. Barbara?
That's interesting. The ethnographer is going to come out in me too. I want to send them out to work shadow school principals and teachers in some of our most disadvantaged schools.
Yes, I can see that sorting quite a bit out, actually. Sam?
My point's very similar to Barbara's. it would be to make time to get out into schools and actually talk to teachers, young people, parents, community members, to make the space to do that so that you understand what's happening underneath the data through which you often read the work of schools. I think that's critically important, as well as being able to point to books like this that actually you can say, go and read this. This is a really useful piece of work that's going to give you the information that you need.
Thanks, Sam. Yes, look, I hope that I hope there are a lot of copies of this book in the mail to various people that might fit this particular profile all over the world. In fact, you could do us all a great favour. Ruth, did you have a response to that one?
Yeah, I'd say the same, but I'd also like to give them a little bit more advice about running their department. So I think they need to create some long-term or permanent positions so that they have some people who can build some policy, history and memory. And as soon as they get those people in place, they should send them on a master's in education or education policy so that they can learn from what's happened before. I'd also suggest that they need to establish a research and evidence strategy, and I'm delighted to say that Welsh had sight this week of something the Welsh government's doing in that department, so they can start to put in place longer term measures for building and sharing and disseminating research evidence. And one of the great things about that emerging strategy is that it does position teachers as knowledge producers as well as consumers. And I also think it's not necessarily realistic for ministers to be spending a lot of time in school themselves, but they need to build that evidence gathering into the roles of their senior staff. So we should never have people from DFE asking academics like me to tell them what's happening in schools. They should be doing that themselves.
Thanks, Ruth. Sol.
Yeah, I would definitely send them the book. I think I wanted to come back on the point about sending ministers out to work in schools, because people may not remember, and there's a politician in England called Ian Duncan Smith, who was conservative politician responsible for really brutal changes to the welfare system over the last decade, and he went to Glasgow, a very poor part of Glasgow, and this apparently changed him, but it didn't change him at all. It meant he was it just re-embedded his ruthless nastiness, which has resulted in hundreds of thousands of people dying on benefits over the last 10 years. So I'm not sure that we can really hope to change some people. And that's not to say that I think some people that we shouldn't, everyone should stop engaging. But from my point of view, I don't think we can engage in England with the current government in a meaningful way, unfortunately, and that the energy needs to be primarily in constructing other forms of engagement with education.
Thanks, Sol. And Gemma.
I think the problems in politics are deeper than just about education. And part of what seems, to have been going on, if we do think back to Trump in America, if we do think back to the fact that the last president of the United States continues to claim that he won the election, and I'm not sure what proportion of the American population still believe him on that one, but quite a large proportion. We are living in a world of discursive bubbles where a lot of the judgment calls that politicians make are about the discursive bubble they live in. So I've said in other contexts, I've heard Rory Stewart, ex-Tory MP, now working at Yale University, give a telling example of taking to Boris Johnson, our current Prime Minister, when he was Foreign Secretary, a series of proposals for things that Boris could do and that would be helpful in the world, and each one got turned down. In the end, Rory came to the conclusion that as a junior minister, Foreign Secretary had no intention of doing anything. He has concluded from this that populist politicians aren't actually interested in governing. Actually, what they do once elected is they campaign and they carry on campaigning. And I think the evidence is stacking up for the current Tory administration in this country that it has no interest in governing. It has interest in precisely articulating and getting front lines in the Tory press and producing a kind of mini version of the culture wars that will presumably sell newspapers. It doesn't actually change things on the ground. Now, that means that dealing with politicians who are preoccupied with polling, who are preoccupied with what focus groups think, who are preoccupied with that dimension to thinking about their job makes things difficult, not least because education in that context holds all of the trouble that there is within our economy. It holds all the trouble that exists because of economic restructuring, which is producing fabulous wealth at the top and dire poverty down at the bottom. It's very hard to get out of that unless we get back to the realities of what schooling is about. In the end of the day, schooling is teachers in classrooms with children, building a relationship with them regardless. And for me, that remains my political priority, is to keep that in mind. I have tried talking to the current Labour front bench. It's hard going. Their latest policy is better. It is a significant improvement. I don't know quite how that's happened. Where conversations are possible, we should carry on having the conversations. I think we just have to be realistic about what we can do.
Thanks, Gemma. I feel like you took us to the brink of the abyss there, but brought us back to a tiny bit of optimism at the end. And I was thinking as you were speaking about, you know, we in Australia, I think it's not dissimilar in that much of the policy environment that we live with now was actually invented by our previous Labor government. And, you know, it was almost like they rolled out the blueprint and then the Conservatives said, oh, thanks for that, we'll just continue on that kind of trajectory. So it's not even a kind of party political thing in that it, you know, one builds on the other. We are just about at the end of our time, but I think we're going to move to one final poll and then a bit of an interactive activity before we finish up. So you should be able to see on your screen there now a rating poll with the question, do the activities of academics, researchers need to change at all to bring about policy change? So you might want to vote in that. I think there's probably not a lot of surprises there either. In the spirit of the book, which, you know, as you would know, seeks to not only help us understand the problems, but to think through some productive ways of attacking these problems, Ruth and Deb were really keen for us to end on a note that was focused a little bit on action. So to that end, I'm going to ask you all to provide in either a word or a short phrase. And I'm conscious that as a species, we academics aren't always good with the short phrase, but try and give it a go. In answer to the question, what is most needed to ensure that education policy mistakes are put right and avoided in future? And as we do that, a word cloud should magically appear on the screen before us. And I think we can see there's some key ideas certainly around dialogue and listening, and much of the discussion tonight has really, or this morning, has really been about that. But also the idea that as an education research community and as educators, we might find ways of placing public pressure and possibly even private pressure on policymakers to bring them into that kind of dialogue. I think what we've heard and discussed today is perhaps underlined for us not only the sad state of affairs that we find ourselves in, and Ruth and Deb have written that the combinations of misunderstandings and mistakes that produce educational problems and reinforce educational inequalities in ways exactly opposite to their espoused intentions, but also hopefully some optimism around creating change collectively. And I think that this is something which organisations like BERA and AARE have a really special role to play in fostering and brokering relationships between academics, policymakers, practitioners, and supporting people who've got expertise in education beyond just having been to school themselves. And we've had some discussion about that tonight as well, to speak alternative visions and understandings into the public space. We're going to leave the word cloud up for the moment, and if you've got some other ideas that you'd like to add as you head out the door, then please do that. But with that, this morning or this evening's session comes to a close. Thank you so much once again to Deb and Ruth for the invitation to all of us to participate in this evening. And policymakers, as well as within the academic community. Thanks very much, everyone, and good night to you all. Good day to you.
Thank you for joining our BERA virtual event. Before you go, if you can please answer a quick poll to let us know how you found the event.